is the Team Babel Fish demo. Next. The mission for Team Babel Fish was to research and or create a framework for describing relationships or equivalencies, synonyms, mappings, whatever your preferred term is, between xAPI verbs. So I'll just refer to them as links. And then our other mission was to create a proof of concept that actually demonstrates the use of these links in some example use cases. And we quickly thought of a few sample use cases in different contexts in an analytics system, an LMS or an analytics platform. Verb disambiguation would be valuable when analyzing and providing insights. In an LRS itself, it might be necessary to disambiguate as an LRS either accept statements or after the fact for reporting. And for activity providers, it might be valuable to be able to toggle or target verbs to particular LRSs. So instead of using a fixed set of verbs, be able to dynamically switch vocabularies as the activity provider communicates with an LRS. So because of my background with the LCMS, we chose the last use case to concentrate for the cohort, and that is as an activity provider. And with that, we'll move on to some milestones. Our milestones for the cohort were we had 2 fixed milestones and then 8-ish stretch goals. So we implemented some of the stretch goals, and we're still researching some of the others. So for the 2 concrete goals or milestones, one was to first demonstrate sending statements to multiple LRSs, and then sending statements to multiple LRSs with LRS-specific verbs or that LRS's preferred vocabulary. The stretch goals were to investigate formats for machine-readable vocabularies, investigating methods to link vocabularies and describe that link in a machine-readable format. We also have discussed the concept of a vocabulary service and an LRS registry service. These stretch goals we actually implemented, 7 and 8. That was to investigate a verb whitelist and a verb blacklist. So that gives the ability as a activity provider targets multiple LRSs to hide some verbs and show others. So control which verbs get sent to each LRS. And then the last 2 milestones were investigating the concept of an xAPI proxy service and then a client library that sits on top of that. So I'll go into the actual demo of sending statements to multiple LRSs using different vocabulary for each LRS. Oops. Jump back. So first let me show multiple LRSs. This is my clean ADL LRS. I also have an account on the, let it catch up for a bit. I also have an account on the Storm Cloud LRS. So I'm going to launch some content in the Learning Content Management System.
Okay.
And then go back to the LRSs and show that activity presented with different vocabulary. So this is a test harness to launch into some content. So this is the learning object called International Business Travel. We access the first page. Pause for a little bit to let it catch up. I'll access the second page. Then I'll access one more thing, which is an assessment. Actually take the assessment. One answer wrong. Give a shout out to Craig.
Totally true.
For some reason. Well, let's just get that one wrong. It's not clicking. So we should okay. We actually got a 0% on that, but I should have gotten the shout out to Craig question right. But in this case, it's 0%. And then let's log into those LRSs and see the activity. So this shouldn't be new to anybody. The statements we sent were the initial launch of the business travel course.
Mm-hmm.
You'll notice here that the verb is in the IBM vocabulary. It's an IBM verb launched. Then we had 3 accesses. So there were the access to the first page, this named in introduction. That is a verb accessed. So these 3, and you'll notice that it's, just to show you the rest of the statement, the actor was my user that I'm logged in as, Kirby Bell. Verb was IBM accessed, and the object was a page named introduction with this ID. But if I log into this Storm Cloud LRS, you'll see that I'm using a different vocabulary. So let's just pick. You'll see that the verb in this case was translated or transformed to and the ADL verb, experienced. Everything else is the same. The actor is the same. The object's the same, but the verb is different. So I think I translated launched to ADL's launched. Accessed, I translated to experienced. And then IBM scored, I translated to, well, in this case, it's still, no, that's the actor. Where's the verb? Verb, I translated that to ADL scored verb.
Hmm.
So that's a demonstration of the dynamic translation or mapping to a target LRS's vocabulary. The constructs we use to build this are a local, what we're calling the LRS cache. That's just a local listing of configured LRSs. There could be many of these. This is also where the actual mappings are stored, and I'll show this in a minute. This is also where the whitelist is stored and where the blacklist is stored per LRS. The xAPI controller is what does all the work. It reads the data from the LRS cache. It's the code that actually sends statements to each LRS. After reading the LRS cache, it will map the local verb to the preferred verb for the target LRS. It also respects the whitelisting and blacklisting, and it also does the localization of the local verbs.
Right.
We did not localize the target or mapped verbs, and I can explain why after I show you the mapping. So here's the example of the local mapping. We could have done this in a database or any data store, but for the purposes of the POC, we chose a simple XML file. This is where we list all target LRSs. This is where we whitelist the verbs that are allowed to be sent to that LRS. In this case, the ADL LRS, we said we're allowed to send launched, access, and score. These are all keyed by the local LCMS verb or the IBM verb. The second LRS was the Storm Cloud LRS. This is where we actually did the mappings. So in this case, I mapped the IBM direct launched verb to ADL's launched verb. And for the POC, we're just including the English display of that particular target verb in the mapping. But in the future, if we continue down this path, we would obviously map verbs in such a way that we would be able to map all the localized verbs as well, or localization of each verb. This verb also had, this LRS also had a whitelist. It only wanted to see launched, access, and score. Then I added a third LRS where I'm blacklisting certain verbs. So if we look at the first 2 verbs, I blacklisted launched and access, so we should only see the score. I have that LRS up here. Pause for a moment. In this case, in the exact same time period, you'll notice that only the score of the quiz made it. I did not map these verbs to a new to an LRS targeted verbs. In this case, we sent the IBM verb localized with the result of 0. Back to the presentation. Okay, what's next? We showed the LRS config. Like I said, in the future, that would either be some other data store possibly, but it would definitely be, we would better localize the verbs that we map to, because we want to send verbs with as much information as possible, especially localized values. So that's what we've done so far. We've done a lot of research and reading into RDF, but nothing that's presentable at this point. So I have that listed first on our list of things to do in the future, and that is to research formats for machine-readable vocabularies. So this is how we will be able to get more information about a vocabulary to better send to the target LRS its verbs. An example of that would be the localized display of that verb instead of how we're doing it today. The next thing we'd like to research more is methods to link or map vocabularies and to describe that in machine-readable format. We think RDF is a probable solution for this as well.
Mm-hmm.
For the actual local LRS cache and controller, like we've been saying, we'd like to localize target verbs better. And potentially, if use cases, we can think of more use cases, provide more complex mapping capabilities. So for example, maybe we could whitelist or blacklist certain verbs only in context of a certain activity, object activity, or in context of other metadata or extensions about the statement. Right now, it's all based on verb and verb alone.
Mm-hmm.
Some other future items is implementing the xAPI proxy service. So what that would be is an HTTP interface sitting on top of that controller. So you can send, it'd be very similar to an LRS interface where you send its statement, but then from there we would broadcast to multiple LRSs different statements in different vocabularies or different verbs. So basically it's just like how the xAPI controller internally works today, but there would be an HTTP interface on top of it.
Right.
And then we also would like to implement a client API that sits on top of that. It would be very similar to the ADL JavaScript API. It would communicate with the proxy, and then the controller would do its work, and then communicate to one or many LRSs. And the last items were the discussion about a registry service and a vocabulary service. So what a registry service would potentially be is the concept of the LRS cache. Instead of feeding it data through an XML file like we're doing today, extract that out of the application and host that as a service that can be useful to multiple applications, like an LMS or a analytics tool. That's where we define vocabularies, define whitelists, define blacklists. And the vocabulary service would potentially be where we could host vocabularies and also define links between vocabularies. So instead of the mapping living locally, we could create the mappings in a vocabulary service.
Right.
And then the LRS cache could read from that and provide its data to the xAPI controller. This is just a quick drawing of the components or constructs that I described today. So what we saw earlier was the delivery interface, communicating with the delivery service, which in turn talks to the xAPI controller, which reads its data from the LRS cache. Everything is gray as potential or future, so it's possible that the LRS cache could get its data from a vocabulary service or a registry service instead of providing APIs directly to the LRS cache. It can read from some other service with a to-be-determined specified interface. The xAPI proxy is to be developed just as the client API is. So in this case, for example, there would be perhaps some other application and not something native to the LCMS that, or if there's an extension on top of the LCMS where third parties or customers could write to the API, which in turn write to the proxy, which would talk to the controller, which would talk to the multiple LRSs. And then one item I left open here, it is in blue because we did implement this. I think we have time for a quick bonus demo of not only broadcasting xAPI statements in a delivery scenario, but we could broadcast xAPI statements in an authoring scenario. And I can actually show that. So here's the actual, this is an interface to the Learning Content Management System where I'm editing the business travel course that we just consumed. This is the actual object that I launched from that test harness with its 2 pages and the quiz. I'll quickly add a topic, edit it, save, whoops, save, and I'm going to delete it. And I'm going to, I blacklisted from the 2 original LRSs, but if I go to the, I think it's this LRS, refresh, you'll see that there are 3 statements, one for the create, the IBM LCMS xAPI verb create. We created a new topic with this ID by this user ID. I'm actually logged in as a different user to the LCMS Kirby Bell. So that is an example of potentially using xAPI for in a different context, not only for delivery, but for management and creation of content as well.
Cool.
Back to the slide. And that's it for the demo. Any questions?
None for me, actually, though I appreciate the additional, the bonus demo part. The one thing I'm thinking, of course, as I'm looking at this, one, you bring up a lot of good points about you know, how we're going to be handling vocabulary in the future, I think, or at least what you're demonstrating for me is presaging some of the decisions we'll have to make. I think Jason is on. Jason Haig is on. Jason, did you have any questions for Kirby? No? Or he may be muted. No, none at the moment. But Kirby, thank you so much for this. I probably will have a couple follow-up things. Actually, I've got a store of follow-up things actually for you and for a couple of the groups that I need to ask. But no, Jason's mic is not connected, so he can't talk. No, sorry about that. But I think that I think we've mentioned this before, but there is a xAPI vocabulary working group going on right now. And I think it'd be interesting for you to be involved, for you and Adi to be involved in that, especially on the strength of what you just shown us. So thank you.
No problem.
Oh, actually, one more thing. I'm sorry, I wanted to ask. The code for what you've been working on and some of the and any of the I guess documentation. Are you making those available someplace other than, or are they in the Google Plus community?
The code won't, but if we specified some interfaces to a service, we definitely want to communicate that and get everybody's input on that. And,
right, of course.
And also we would communicate any of our lessons learned about researching machine-readable formats for vocabularies and machine-readable formats for RDF. But the code to actually communicate and send the statements, most of that is just making calls to the ADL Java API, and then the rest of it is kind of embedded into existing LCMS. I think if we pulled it out into a service, it might be possible to expose that.
Cool. I know that Jessie has a question, so let me go ahead and unmute her. Hey, Jessie, you're unmuted.
Hi. This is a very good idea about vocabulary. From my experience, for example, when I discussed with H5P CEO about the statements of their widget. For example, he think when learner is answering a quiz, and the learner could like click around those alternatives, and then finally he sends submit or check answer. And he think when he clicks around the alternative, he use attempt, and then when he submit, he use completed. But I told him that most of the case I see we use answer when the learner submit the question. What I'm trying to say is I saw too many cases. There are different opinions about which verb we should use for different actions, and we seems it's not possible to avoid this kind of different opinions. But if in this example, how we should leverage your work?
I definitely think what you said is correct. Disambiguation of verbs is definitely a problem to solve in the future, and there's different points it could be solved. You might have an LRS that receives statements from many activity providers. You'd have to disambiguate at that point. You could also depend on activity providers to make sure that they communicate in a preferred vocabulary or set of verbs. Or you can do it at analysis time, or as the LRS retrieves statements. I think there's a lot of different points in time where you could do the disambiguation or do the translation or verb mapping, but where you do it is, I don't think, isn't as important as making sure that they're linked or mapped somehow, so we don't see the confusion or have the confusion that you're describing.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about when we collect data from different LRs, and those LRs could use different set of verbs, and when we integrate those data into one reporting? And yeah.
That's definitely another use case where verb linking or mapping would be beneficial.
Uh-huh. So that's not in your plan?
Right now everything's just a proof of concept, so something in our plan is to investigate the concept of a service that hosts different vocabularies and provides the linking between them.
Mm-hmm.
And if we worked on that, that's something we would share with the community and get the community's input on and help to define a common interface for this concept of a service. At this point, we don't know whether it would be valuable or not. The same goes for the other potential service, which is I think I had the vocabulary service and then remember the names of my own service.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the registry service itself.
Right.
So one would just be a registry of LRSs and the preferred vocabularies and whitelists and blacklists, and one, the vocabulary service, that's where the actual linking between verbs is stored somehow. I think at this point we need to just communicate with the larger community, decide what is valuable, what is not valuable, and then we would contribute in that way in the form of some sort of interface. I think a proxy to a service like the controller, that might be something valuable.
Yeah.
You could send statements to a proxy service, and then it broadcasts to many LRSs.
Right.
But like I said, we're not sure. It's all proof of concept now and still in research.
Yeah, and I like the localized value you mentioned. Especially we have a Chinese DOP. I like the localization.
Yeah.
part.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jesse.
You're welcome.
Looks like John has a question as well. Hey, John Costa, how are you?
Oh, good. It just made me think, and you may have kind of answered this in your architecture here, but the different vocabularies that people might use, is the thought behind this to have it almost like a DTD that sort of travels with your use case, and it would make it easy for people to go into it and see what the definitions of all the verbs and stuff you're using, and then create whatever transforms they need if they want to map statements across?
Right. So that would be where we would need help from everybody else in defining one way to create a machine-readable linking between vocabularies, and then create some sort of service that can host those links or mappings. And then systems like this, whether it's a LRS or analytic solution or an activity provider like LCMS, it could go and get its data from a service like that and be prepared. So when someone uses a product like this, in this case an activity provider, that activity provider could connect to a service, retrieve a bunch of pre-mapped vocabularies, and then ask the user of that activity provider or that system which one they want to use, or not even ask them at all, just say maybe those mapped vocabularies are bound to particular LRSs. So the user of the activity provider, in the activity provider use case, would just need to decide which LRSs they want to communicate with.
Mm-hmm.
And then the mapping would in turn decide for them which vocabulary to use to that LRS, because someone in advance registered that LRS and linked or mapped to its mapped its favorite or preferred vocabulary. And so that activity provider would have to upload in some standard format, like you say, maybe RDF. It would have to upload its vocabulary to the service and map it to an LRS's preferred vocabulary. So it potentially wouldn't have to change its code if it could talk to a proxy and have it do the mapping and sending to the target LRS for it. Or it could internally have an implementation that reads the mappings from a service, and then it knows what vocabulary to use when communicating with the target LRS.
Yeah, but if that's a standard, then everybody's developing everything. All the visualizations and stuff are all developed towards these vocabularies, and then you're just mapping your visualization to whichever one you want, and it's going to have accurate data. That's cool. Thank you. This is very good.